Last week, when we explored Sarah's laugh, we celebrated the gift of living in a golden age where women's voices are reshaping our oldest questions. This week, we go further. We're joined by Professor Rabbi Wendy Zierler, Sigmund Falk Professor of Modern Jewish Literature and Feminist Studies at HUC-JIR, ordained by Yeshivat Maharat, and author of Going Out with Knots, My 2 Kaddish Years with Hebrew Poetry, which was just published. Together, we'll read the gaps in Genesis as invitations. Why does the life of Sarah tell us about her burial rather than her living? Is Abraham coming to mourn because he wasn't there when she died? What happens when Rashi, Ramban, and Toldot Yitzchak meet a modern midrash that imagines Sarah charting her own course? We'll weave classical commentary with Hebrew poetry, Leia Goldberg's threefold world, Yehuda Amichai's men, women, and children, and Muhammad Weiss, the chapters of our mothers, to ask how a feminist midrash doesn't replace tradition so much as complete it, illuminating the questions the text itself provokes but never answers. Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and on Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on your favorite podcast platform and now on YouTube and Substack. We also publish a source sheet on Sefaria, and a link is included in the show notes. This week we read Parshat Chayei Sarah. Join us for a conversation with Professor Rabbi Wendy Zierler, a scholar dedicated to the enterprise of feminist midrash, who has recently published a book on Hebrew poetry. We're excited to explore a feminist midrashic approach to Sarah and to get a taste of what Hebrew poetry has to teach us about our matriarchs. Wendy, thank you so much for joining us. We're real excited.
It's such a pleasure.
And as I said in the intro, last week we were talking about Sarah's laugh and how God or somebody accused her, did you laugh? And she said no. And we looked at the Torah commentary of women in Sfaria, and we were blown away by a totally new approach. So we're excited to start looking at the Torah all over again through the eyes of women who have so much to add and have been kind of behind that veil, standing by the doorway, ready to laugh, incite, contribute. So I want to start because I kind of discovered you in a thetorah.com article. At Madlik, we love thetorah.com. And it talks literally about our Parsha, and it asks some interesting questions. But let's start with the Parsha itself. It says, now Sarah's life was 100 years old and 20 years and 7 years, thus years of Sarah's life. So the interesting thing is that it talks about her death, even though the Parsha itself is called Chayei Sarah. And in your article, you says it gives us very little insight into Sarah's internal religious life. Isn't it kind of ironic and maybe representative of how women are represented in the Torah that we have a parsha called Chayei Sarah and we talk about her death?
Certainly, this opening to the parasha is a real provocation to try and tease out from whatever we do have of Sarah's life, whatever detail we do have in the text, to find out something about her and to imagine, to fill in the gaps of her text. I will say, apropos of your teaser where you talked about discovering Sarah's laughter, I mean, we know that Avram laughed, and then she laughs and she sort of gets slammed for it by God. But later it's as though her laugh gets approved and endorsed. She gets the last word on laughing, because when Yitzchak is born, she names him and basically creates a liturgy for his birth, a celebratory liturgy. Batomer Sarah tzchok asali Elohim. God made laughter for me. Kol hashomea yitzchak li. Anyone who hears will laugh along with me. And then recite a poem herself. So we know that there's a lot there to Sarah. We know there has to be more than what this kind of dismissing her off stage in Parshat Chayei Sarah seems to imply. We know that there has to be more because God insists that she has to be the progenitor of the next generation. Moreover, we've got this loud pronouncement by God in Genesis 21, Kol asher tomar elecha Sarah shema bekola. Anything that Sarah says to, listen to her, be obedient to her. So my question is, of course, what is it about Sarah's life that we want to emulate? Why is it that she is held out as this matriarch? And so I try to both call attention to what's there in the biblical text, but then imagine the empty spots in different ways.
I mean, there's so much. Like in the Akedah last week, we were kind of reading between the lines. There's the midrash that says the Torah was written in white ink and on white parchment. And I think the endeavor that you're involved with your peers is to coax out what's in between the lines. Sarah is the only matriarch who tells us how long she lived. Everett Fox points out, and then the next mystery that comes up is in the next verse. And Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Talk to us about what is the question that all the commentaries are asking here.
Okay, so what is glaring and calls out for comment here is the idea that at the end of the Akedah in Bereshit Kaf Bet, Abraham is described as going to Beersheba, and then we find out later that Sarah dies in Kiryat Arba. So it seems that at her death, they're not living together. And this is something that the commentaries can't suffer, that idea. Whereas I actually believe, and here I think that the text is telling us something very directly, that the Torah is very honest to us about what the Akedah exercise, what kind of effect it has on the family. I don't think that it's an accident that Bereshit Kaf Bet begins with under the sign of love. And it's the first time that the verb ahava appears in the Bible. Kach et bincha eichidcha asher ahavta et Yitzchak. The first time we ever hear that verb. And that by the end of that parak, at the end of that chapter, love disappears out of the text. When God says, you've done this thing, ata yadati ki yirei Elohim ata, I now know you're a God-fearer, ki lo chasachta et bincha et yechidcha, that you didn't withhold your son, your only son, and it doesn't say asher ahavta. And my reading, I mean, what lurks behind my Torah.com article is a kind of pre-existent reading where that asks the question, where the rabbis ask, where was Sarah in the Akedah? Why is she absent? And they supply different answers. My understanding is she's there to represent another alternative. If Avraham shows and succeeds in a test of God awe, of God fear, then Sarah is reserved. Her absence reserves another option, which is the option of love. And that's why the second time the verb ahava appears is at the end of Genesis 24, where we hear that Yitzchak took Rivka into his mother's tent and loved her. I see the Torah being very honest about what it means that Avram was willing so utterly to obey God and detach from all earthly commitments. That's why at the end of the Akedah, when it says, the word Yachdav is not used in relation to Yitzchak and Avram, but it's Avram and Na'arav. That's a very loud rhyme. So my argument is that there's a breakdown in the relationship between Avram and Yitzchak at the end of the Akedah. There's a breakdown in the relationship between Avram and Sarah at the end of the Akedah. And, dare I say, there's a breakdown in the relationship between Avraham and God at the end of the Akedah, because never does God speak to Avram directly again. In fact, at the end of Genesis 22, he only speaks to him through an angel. And the next thing we know is Avram needs to get a match for his son, and he's doing it through the agency of somebody else, not himself. There's a lack of that. That attachment is broken down, and so attachment has to be reconstituted elsewhere through Sarah. And so she represents that model. Her absence is actually a very loud presence in my view.
And is that why at the end of this week's parasha that Rivka replaces Sarah? That's an important piece?
Yes, if any that Rivka comes, Rivka and Sarah are identified with one another. Now, on the one hand, Rivka continues Avram's model in that she's someone who left Haran. She is a leave taker, and yet she's right away signaled as an object of love. And so she, in my view, marks the reinsertion of ahava into the text. And in fact, the possibility of family continuity, because if you're going to kill your son on a mountaintop, that son is not going to be available to be your successor and your descendant on the most basic level. And so what I wrote in the Torah.com is kind of a sequel to that, or it's the backstory. How is it that Sarah was able to exercise some agency even though she wasn't there on that mountaintop?
What I want to kind of focus on is in the rabbinical commentaries that you cite, Rashi, Ramban, and others, it's almost painful to watch them try to figure out why Abraham was not with Sarah. It is so beyond them to believe that Sarah could be independently living on her own, not like Hagar, that she was exiled. She didn't go back to her father's house. She's an independent woman by living by herself. Rashi says, you know what? Abraham was doing chores or something, and it was on his way home, and he got caught away from home when he got that call. Ramban, it's a very, very long Ramban, talks about also that it must be that he was just doing some errands while he was in Hebron. It seems to me that because they couldn't imagine that Sarah was living by herself, it affected their commentary. And I think that that the most basic, I guess, trivial level, the fact that you, a woman, is willing to look at it and say they were separated, opens up, first of all, to throw out a lot of kind of splitting hairs and going in the wrong direction, but also enables us to focus on why they were living alone and why Isaac was not with his father either, and why he was by himself. But I want to focus on Sarah, and not on Abraham so much. And you spoke a little bit about this concept that love was missing, and I love that as well. But then why don't you talk about the midrash that we now are kind of given license to write, now that we say that no, they were separated, they were living alone. What then can you understand and fill in the blanks about Sarah that we now have license to imagine?
Yeah. So look, I think that the rabbis in the Middle Ages also they elevated the Akedah, spiritual exercise, in ways that I don't think I share that same conviction, and maybe because they were living in a world of common martyrdoms. But getting to your question, I mean, once you imagine the possibility that there was a real rift, or that there was a difference of opinion, different spiritual directions, instead of imagining that Sarah got wind of the Akedah and dropped dead on the spot out of the shock of it, or instead of imagining, as the Midrash in Tanhuma does, that Abraham resorts to all kinds of stratagems to deceive her. You know, he says there's no way that she's ever going to agree to this Akedah exercise. I better pretend that I'm taking Yitzhak out to like an outward bound trip, that I'm taking him like off to Cheder or so on. Because otherwise, if she hears about this, she'll kill herself. I'm imagining that she heard about this, and knowing that the initial news that she would give birth, that she would have a child, happened in Elonei Mamre, which is just, a few paces away from Kiryat Arba. She went back to the place of that original prophecy, that original visitation from the three angels, and waited for them to come again. And because she couldn't imagine theologically that this God who had directed their lives and brought her this beneficence, this great like embodied laughter known as Yitzchak, that would ever ask for that joy to be destroyed just for the sake of some kind of test. And that she would wait for these angels to show. She would laugh when in gratitude when they showed up. And then she would say, please do me a favor. Go, one of you, to Hara Moriah and tell him whatever you need to tell him to get him to feel that he's still okay even if he doesn't do this thing. In other words, that's why we have one malach, we have then it repeated. Stop him from his sense, his conviction that unless he does this thing, he's fallen short. And once she does that, once she knows that Yitzchak is safe and that he's going to survive, given how old she is able to meet, to meet her end. And that's why she lives in Kiryat Arba, because she's returning to that original scene. In my Torah.com article, I talk about how Avram is perennially restless. He goes from place to place to place to place to place. And that most of the time we see Sarah just being taken with as if a passive agent. And I wanted to suggest that there has to be something more than that passivity to justify her being such a linchpin in the history of this first stage of our, founding family.
It's interesting. One of the commentaries you bring, Toldot Yitzchak, actually asks two questions. The first question is why they're not living together. But the second question is, and this kind of relates to the book that we'll get to in a second, why did Abraham not do any long-term planning? Why didn't he buy a plot, asks the Toldot Yitzchak. And what he answers is that Sarah knew that she had to be buried in Canaan. And when she felt that she was losing her health, she went there. But I think that's another way of saying that Sarah determined where the Marachat HaMapela was. Sarah determined that there were not only going to be patriarchs, there were going to be matriarchs. And in a sense, it was Sarah who determined that this was going to be the anchor of the Jewish people, that in this place, she was coming back to that place where the three angels came. She was waiting for angels that never came to tell her about the Akedah. But in a sense, it wasn't a foreseen conclusion that we were going to have three avot and arba imahot, that we were going to have strong patriarchs. And here she really determined the architecture and the geography of the Jewish people. And that's how profound she was, both in life and in death.
I mean, I just wonder, you say that, she determines it. Wendy, from the fact that God changes her name also, that she's a player, that she's part of the covenant. It would have been very easy for God to change Abraham's name, and Sarah would have remained Sarai. And the covenant is through Abraham, it's through Isaac, and through Jacob. And the wives are the wives. But the Torah from the very beginning goes out of its way to say that Sarah's part of the covenant. I wonder how that plays out in the Chayei Sarah story.
Well, I'll tell you how I think it plays out. I think it's extremely important to note that Sarah has her name changed because she's the only matriarch that we have who experiences a name change. And the next person to experience a name change is Yaakov, who goes from Yaakov to Yisrael. And I make an argument in my article and elsewhere that, in effect, what that means is that Yaakov is named after Sarah, because it says, Ki sarita im Elohim va'adam, that word sarita is an evocation of Sarah. Right? So Yisrael has that root. And so we're seeing in that naming that, he becomes the eponymous hero of the whole of Genesis in being Yisrael for us. That is bringing Sarah back into the center of the action. And that her struggles, whatever it is that she went through in having to assert her position, both vis-a-vis Hagar, but also with Avram, that is something that gets echoed and developed in the personality of Yaakov turned Yisrael.
I love that. I mean, last week we read into her laughter exactly that arguing, struggling with God, wrestling with God that you just brought out. That was a very strong laugh. But I want to segue now into your book, which I read cover to cover in the last 24 hours. I absolutely love. You might not know this, but on Madlik, we love to go back to the Yahadut Yisraelit, Israeli Judaism in the kibbutzim. And we look at kibbutzim Haggadot, and we just love going back because they look at Judaism totally differently. You have done the same thing with Hebrew poetry. And this book is so many things. One of it, as I alluded to before, it occurred because you lost your parents, your father tragically, then your mother-in-law. You were in multiple years of mourning, and teaching this Hebrew poetry was what kind of enabled you to move from the different moments and tragedies that you were. But what I'd like to do is to now go into that poetry. And what I've done, with your permission, is pick 3 poems. I don't know whether we'll have a chance to get to all 3 of them. But the first one deals with Al Shlosha Dvarim, and it is written by Leia Goldberg. And it's a kind of a rumination on 3 things the world stands: Al Torah, Avodah, V'Gemilot Chasadim, but it puts a new twist on it. Give us a sense of what Leia Goldberg is doing in this poem. Teach it like you would on a Tuesday morning.
Oh, I probably need a little bit more time, but I'll say it over as quickly as I can. So what we know from Pirkei Avot is that there were 2 versions of the 3 cardinal things that the world stands on. There's the Mishnah that comes in, the second Mishnah in the first parak of Pirkei Avot, which comes in the name of Shimon HaTzadik, one of the last elders of the Anshe Knesset Agdolah. He says the world stands on Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim. Before that first chapter of Pirkei Avot ends, we've got another rendition of that in the 18th Mishnah, where Shimon ben Gamliel rewrites it and says that the world stands on Din, Emet, and Shalom. Between the time of Shimon HaTzadik and Shimon ben Gamliel, the temple had been destroyed. The possibility of a kind of more parochial or particularistic list of cardinal 3s was no longer possible. And so the list had to become more universalistic. And what Leia Goldberg is registering in writing her poem in 1949 as part of a series of children's poems is the need in 1949 to recognize the epoch-making event of the establishment of the State of Israel and the need to establish a new set of 3. And that in every major Idan, every major epoch, we're going to have to go through this exercise. And the rabbis have taught us it's a traditional thing to negotiate a new list. Now, what Leia Goldberg does in the poem, it's called Al Shlosha Dvarim, and she has 3 different versions of workers of a sort who assert their 3 important things. I'll note that all of their things are work. So, like, if we were to sing the song, it would be Al Avodah, Ve'al Avodah, Ve'al Avodah, because that's what mattered at the beginning of the State of Israel, to assert productive labor. But Leia Goldberg, as a person who understood the legacy of the spirit, first of all, she includes the artist among her workers. She has a fisherman, a farmer, and an artist. So you need the sea, the land, and also the mind, the heart, the spirit. And then she goes to the 4th principle. So she busts up the rule of 3, which we can say is, Shlosha Avot. She says Arba Imahot. She gives us the human being, the Adam. And we know from Bereshit Aleph that the Adam is created b'tzelem Elohim Zachar u'Nekeva. So the human being, Ha-Adam, is an egalitarian construct. And that Ha-Adam is not limited by 3 things. Nor is that Adam limited to one sphere of activity. That Adam is interconnected and makes allusions and references to what matters to the farmer and what matters to the fisherman and what matters to the artist, and also alludes to other matters of the spirit and Jewish culture, Chagim and Chulin, holidays and weekdays. That human being is hapokeach einav, which makes us think of the brachot in the Birkot HaShachar, pokeach ivrim. Now, what of course she's noting, and we can't ignore it, is she's offering us a secular list that is nevertheless informed and inspired by Judaism, by Jewish culture.
And what I love, and you say this later in the book, is as you correctly say, man was created male and female, androgynous possibly. She almost transcends gender. By being a woman, she not only can take us to look at things as a woman, but can also say, just get rid of the whole gender thing. Look at the rainbow palette, is how you translate it. It opens it up. I think what I think about when I think of on three things is a tripod. And there's nothing sturdier and more set than a tripod. We're just giving you a taste, dear listener of Madlik, of what's in this book, because every one of these poems is a gem. I read it in Kindle, and in the subnotes, there's a hyperlink to songs where Arik Einstein is singing a poem. It just makes you so proud of our culture that we have pop singers singing poetry. But the next thing you go to is Yehuda Amichai, and he talks about men, women, and children, and he talks about this tripod and how he wants to be a part of this tripod. He's almost jealous that he's not included with, on the one hand, he goes Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but he also talks about blood, sweat, and tears. He talks about, does he say cheresh, shota, v'katan? He says widows, orphans, and bereaved parents. There are so many threesomes there that are packed that he almost wants to be a part of this rowdy crew, but it's kind of there's a tension there because he's acknowledging that some of them are at the bottom of the pile.
Yeah, this is a poem written from the point of view of someone who feels like such a super outsider. If only he could have belonged to some trio. And if we think about triangles, this stability of the triangle, it's the geometric form that has the least number of lines yet is still closed, right? It's that stable form, and he wishes that he could be part of some sort of stable form, even if it would mean being part of that category of the disenfranchised or the bereaved, those who actually are not considered halakhically responsible, or to be disabled in some manner, just to be part of something. And yet, I note in my analysis of this poem that he keeps on saying, "Ani rotze liot," I want to belong to something. And when you say I so many times, then you're asserting that individuality, the very same idiosyncratic outsider, not quite fitting into like the square peg in a round hole sensibility that gets him in this situation to begin with, where he doesn't feel like he belongs to anything. And he makes clear what he's looking for in this three is something permanent, in the same way that al shloshah dvarim ha'olam omed is a sense of permanence. I note in my book that I read this as an explicit allusion to Leia Goldberg, who of course is explicitly alluding to the sages, because we know that Leia Goldberg was a major mentor for Yehuda Amichai, which is an extraordinary historical fact, because until then, we do not have an example of a single woman poet who was a mentor or a model for an important male writer. It just didn't exist in the Hebrew language.
That's fascinating.
Well, look, my whole career has been dedicated to exploring this one big question, which is what happens when women enter into a Hebrew literary tradition that's been going on since the Bible, where women have been absent since the Bible, with the exception of a handful of poems. There is no full book written in the Hebrew language by a woman since the closing of the biblical canon. It isn't until the 19th century, the very end of the 19th century, that women enter into the Hebrew literary tradition. And so it has to be different if after all this time, women finally can actually represent their own lives and represent their own experiences. And this idea of a woman being the dedication page is an earth-shattering, like a seismic shift. I wrote a book about the first Hebrew woman short story writer, Chava Shapiro, and she dedicated her book in 1908 to her mother, Mukdash Li'imi. It's the first time that we have a dedication by a woman to a woman of that sort. And so these are just among the many, many incredible historical shifts that we've been experiencing over the past century.
I love, the way you weave Yehuda Amichai and the woman that he was inspired by in that narrative. And then the book itself weaves the narrative of those 2-3 years you went through COVID together with your congregation every Tuesday morning, reading one of these poems and making it kind of talk to our situation, your situation. I just love that what your book shows, number one, and I totally recommend it if you're interested in Hebrew poetry. The book is just full of both the Hebrew and the English with the links to the songs sung by pop stars in Israel. And then there's the backstory. One of the earliest women who actually was writing poetry was a niece of Shmuel David Letzato, the Shadal commentary that we love. That comes through. Weaving the stories behind it, we're not going to get a chance to get to the third poem, but I think that's totally in line with where we need to go from here. This is the first chapter, not the last chapter, in looking at these new voices and the way that these poems who are writing in Hebrew, and I'll finish with this, it's the language itself that has within it the ability to carry thoughts that started 2,000 years ago and went through commentaries and through Seder tables and through family histories and land here with all that baggage and all that nuance and give us totally new a sense of what it is our tradition is and makes it sure that it's going to stay alive and have the dynamism that it had at the very beginning. It's a wonderful contribution. I hope you'll come back, Wendy.
Well, I would just say that part of my goal, my whole career, has been to argue that modern Jewish literature can serve as an important layer of commentary on our traditional sources. That just because it doesn't come delivered to us in that conventional form of the hardback, burgundy or navy cover with the gold lettering and the marbleized leaf, that it doesn't mean that it isn't part of our unfolding canon and a very important layer of parshanut. And in the same way that the rabbis often felt the need to fill in gaps, and they used their creativity and their subjectivity to try to bridge the gap between their time and the time of the Tanakh, they teach us how we can, through creative interpretation and through creativity, do that in our own day too.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Wendy.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So run out and get Going Out with Knots, My 2 Kaddish Years with Hebrew Poetry by Wendy Zierler. And truly, I hope we'll have you back again. But thank you so much for joining us. Shabbat Shalom to everyone and enjoy Chayei Sarah.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.